The moment Jake Morrison's eyes locked onto the woman across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, Texas, his world stopped spinning. 23 years had passed since he'd buried his beloved Sarah, yet there she stood, as if time had folded in on itself. Same auburn hair catching the late afternoon sun, same gentle curve of her smile, same way of tucking a strand behind her ear when the wind picked up. His weathered hands trembled as they gripped the porch railing of Murphy's General Store, his heart hammering against his ribs like a wild Mustang trying to break free. The woman was loading groceries into a beat-up Ford pickup, humming a melody that drifted across the street on the desert breeze. Jake's breath caught in his throat. It was Sarah's song, the one she used to sing while hanging laundry on their ranch. The same tune that had echoed through their home during those precious 5 years before the cancer took her away. His boots felt rooted to the wooden planks beneath him, unable to move forward, unable to look away. Cedar Ridge hadn't changed much in the decades since Jake had become its most reclusive resident. The same sun-bleached buildings lined Main Street, the same red dust coated everything, and the same sense of time moving slower than molasses in January pervaded the small Texas town. But this woman, this impossible apparition, had shattered the careful routine Jake had built around his grief. He'd spent 23 years avoiding mirrors that might show him how the years had carved lines into his face, how his once dark hair had turned silver, how his broad shoulders had begun to stoop under the weight of loneliness. Hey, my friends, if you're finding this story as captivating as I am, please hit that subscribe button right now. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything. Don't forget to click that notification bell, and most importantly, hit the hype button because it helps the algorithm share these incredible stories with more people just like you. Your engagement makes all the difference in bringing these emotional journeys to life. The woman finished loading her truck and paused, her hand resting on the tailgate. For a moment, Jake thought she might look his way, might see him standing there like a ghost from her past. But instead, she climbed into the driver's seat and the old Ford rumbled to life with a sound that reminded Jake of his own ranch truck from years gone by. As she pulled away, leaving a small cloud of dust in her wake, Jake finally found the strength to move his legs. He stumbled down the porch steps, his mind reeling with questions that had no logical answers. Sarah was gone. He'd held her hand as she slipped away in that sterile hospital room in Austin, had felt the exact moment her spirit left her body, had buried her in the cemetery on the hill overlooking their ranch. Yet this woman moved with Sarah's grace, smiled with Sarah's warmth, and sang Sarah's song. Murphy's General Store had been Jake's only regular stop in town for the past 2 decades. Old Pete Murphy had known Jake since they were boys, and he was one of the few people who didn't treat Jake like a curiosity or a hermit to be pitied. When Jake pushed through the screen door, the familiar smell of coffee and leather goods greeted him, along with Pete's knowing look. "Saw you out there on the porch, Jake," Pete said, not looking up from the inventory sheet he was marking. "Looked like you'd seen a ghost." The irony of Pete's words wasn't lost on Jake, who managed only a grunt in response. Pete had always been perceptive, reading people like the weather patterns that determined whether crops would flourish or fail. "Who was that woman?" Jake asked, his voice rougher than usual from the emotion lodged in his throat. "The one with the Ford pickup?" Pete's weathered hands paused in their work, and he looked up with eyes that held decades of small-town knowledge. "That'd be Elena Vasquez," Pete replied carefully. "Moved here about 3 months ago from San Antonio. Bought the old Henderson place out on County Road 47. Keeps to herself mostly, but seems nice enough. Why do you ask?" Jake's mind was spinning. The Henderson place was only 5 miles from his own ranch, close enough that he should have noticed a new neighbor. Yet he'd been so wrapped up in his solitary existence that the world could have changed around him without his knowledge. "She looks like someone I used to know," Jake said, the understatement of the century falling flat in the quiet store. Pete's expression softened with understanding. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew about Sarah, knew how her death had changed Jake from a gregarious rancher who helped his neighbors and attended every community gathering into a man who spoke to his horses more than to people. "Sometimes the heart sees what it needs to see," Pete offered gently. "But maybe it's time you started seeing what's actually there." The wisdom in Pete's words hit Jake like a physical blow. For 23 years he'd been living in the past, surrounding himself with Sarah's memory so completely that he'd forgotten how to exist in the present. That evening, Jake sat on his porch as the sun painted the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink that Sarah had always loved. His ranch stretched out before him, 500 acres of rolling hills and mesquite trees that he'd worked with his own hands. The cattle were settled for the night, and the familiar sounds of the countryside created a symphony that usually brought him peace. Tonight, however, his mind was consumed with questions about Elena Vasquez and the impossible resemblance that had shaken him to his core. Sleep eluded Jake that night, and by dawn, he'd made a decision that surprised even him. He was going to drive past the Henderson place just to satisfy his curiosity. He told himself it was neighborly concern, that he should welcome a new resident to the area. But deep down, he knew he needed to see her again, to prove to himself that his grief-stricken mind had simply projected Sarah's image onto a stranger. The Henderson place had been abandoned for nearly a decade, and Jake was amazed at the transformation as he drove up the long gravel driveway. The farmhouse had been painted a warm yellow that reminded him of sunflowers. The porch had been rebuilt with sturdy new railings, and flower boxes filled with colorful blooms adorned the windows. It looked like a home again, lived in and loved, rather than the slowly decaying monument to neglect it had become. Elena was in the front yard, tending to a vegetable garden that hadn't existed the last time Jake had driven past. She wore faded jeans and a blue work shirt, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she moved with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to hard work. When she heard his truck approaching, she straightened and shaded her eyes with her hand, watching him with curious but not unfriendly attention. Jake parked near the gate and climbed out of his truck, his heart racing as he got his first close look at Elena Vasquez. The resemblance to Sarah was even more striking up close, yet now he could see the differences too. Elena's eyes were darker, more chocolate brown than Sarah's hazel, and there was a strength in her posture that spoke of battles fought and won. She was beautiful in her own right, not just as an echo of his lost love. "Can I help you?" Elena asked, her voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of her Hispanic heritage. Her tone was polite but cautious, the wariness of a woman living alone who'd learned to be careful around strangers. Jake realized he'd been staring and quickly removed his hat, a gesture of respect his father had drilled into him decades ago. "I'm Jake Morrison," he said, extending his hand. "I own the ranch about 5 miles down the road. Thought I should introduce myself, welcome you to the neighborhood." Elena's expression relaxed slightly, and she pulled off her gardening gloves before accepting his handshake. Her hand was warm and calloused from honest work, and Jake felt a jolt of electricity at the contact that had nothing to do with Sarah's memory. "Elena Vasquez," she replied with a smile that transformed her entire face. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Morrison. I've been wondering about my neighbors." They stood there for a moment, hands still clasped, and Jake felt something shift inside him like a door that had been locked for decades, suddenly creaking open. "Please call me Jake," he said, reluctantly releasing her hand. "The Henderson place looks wonderful. You've done amazing work here." Elena's smile widened with obvious pride, and she gestured toward the house and gardens. "It's been a labor of love," she admitted. "When I first saw this place, it was in pretty rough shape, but I could see its potential. Sometimes things that look broken just need someone willing to put in the effort to make them whole again." Her words carried a weight that suggested she wasn't just talking about the property, and Jake found himself wondering what had brought her to Cedar Ridge, what she was running from or toward. As they talked, Jake learned that Elena was a retired teacher who'd decided to start fresh after her divorce was finalized. She'd chosen Cedar Ridge because she wanted a quiet place to heal and rebuild, somewhere she could create something beautiful with her own hands. Her passion for gardening and restoration was evident in every detail of the property, from the carefully planned flower beds to the restored vintage mailbox at the end of the driveway. "Would you like some coffee?" Elena asked after they'd been talking for nearly an hour. "I just made a fresh pot, and I have to admit, I don't get many visitors out here." Jake knew he should decline, should maintain the careful distance he'd cultivated for so many years. But something about Elena's genuine warmth made it impossible to refuse. The inside of the farmhouse was as transformed as the exterior, decorated with a mix of rustic charm and modern comfort that felt both welcoming and sophisticated. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, showing Elena with what appeared to be her children and grandchildren. and Jake felt a pang of longing for the family he and Sarah had never had the chance to create. As Elena busied herself in the kitchen, Jake's eyes were drawn to a collection of jewelry displayed in a shadow box on the living room wall. Most of the pieces appeared to be family heirlooms, the kind of treasures passed down through generations. But one necklace made his blood run cold, and he felt the coffee cup slip from his suddenly nerveless fingers. There, mounted on black velvet and displayed like the precious artifact it was, hung a silver locket in the shape of a heart, with intricate Celtic knotwork etched into its surface. It was identical to the necklace he'd given Sarah on their first anniversary, the one she'd worn every day until the cancer treatments made her neck too sensitive for jewelry. The one he'd buried with her, placing it around her neck one final time before the casket was closed forever. The sound of the coffee cup shattering against the hardwood floor brought Elena rushing from the kitchen, concern etched across her features. "Jake, are you all right?" she asked, kneeling to gather the ceramic pieces while Jake stood frozen, his eyes still locked on the impossible necklace displayed on her wall. "That locket," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "Where did you get that locket?" Elena followed his gaze to the shadow box, her expression shifting from concern to confusion as she noticed his fixation on the jewelry display. "Which one?" she asked, though she seemed to sense which piece had captured his attention. "The silver heart? That belonged to my grandmother Rosa. It's been in our family for generations." Jake's mind reeled as he tried to process her words. It couldn't be the same necklace. It was impossible. Yet every detail was exactly as he remembered, down to the tiny chip in the silver near the clasp where Sarah had accidentally dropped it on their kitchen floor years ago. May I see it?" Jake asked, his hands trembling as he reached toward the display case. Elena hesitated for a moment, clearly puzzled by his intense reaction, but something in his expression must have convinced her of the request's importance. She carefully removed the locket from its mounting and placed it in Jake's outstretched palm. The weight of it was exactly as he remembered, and when he turned it over, his heart nearly stopped. There, engraved in Sarah's delicate handwriting, were the words "Forever yours SM. Sarah Morrison." His Sarah. The locket he'd placed around her neck in her casket 23 years ago was somehow here, in the hands of a woman who looked exactly like her, in a house just miles from where they'd built their life together. "This is impossible," Jake breathed, sinking into Elena's couch as his legs gave out beneath him. "This necklace. I buried this necklace with my wife 23 years ago." Elena's face went pale, and she sat down across from him, her dark eyes wide with shock and something that looked like dawning understanding. "Your wife?" Elena whispered. "What was her name?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge to the very fabric of reality. "Sarah Morrison," Jake replied, his voice breaking on her name. "Sarah Michelle Morrison. She died of cancer in 1999. I gave her this locket on our first anniversary, and she never took it off. When she died, I couldn't bear to keep it, so I had the funeral director put it on her before." He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the finality of that moment when the casket had closed forever. Elena's hands flew to her mouth, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God, Jake. I think I know what happened." She stood abruptly and disappeared into what appeared to be a bedroom, returning moments later with a worn leather photo album. "My grandmother Rosa worked at Peaceful Rest Cemetery in Austin for 40 years, Elena said, her voice shaking as she opened the album to a specific page. "She was the head groundskeeper, and she had a problem. She couldn't stop herself from taking things from the graves. Small things, jewelry mostly. She said the dead didn't need them, but the living did." Jake stared at the photograph Elena showed him. It was an older Hispanic woman standing proudly in front of a cemetery office, wearing a uniform and holding a certificate of some kind. But what made Jake's blood run cold was what she was wearing around her neck, Sarah's locket. "She took it," Jake said, the words coming out flat and emotionless as his mind struggled to process this revelation. "She robbed my wife's grave." Elena nodded miserably, tears continuing to flow down her cheeks. "I found out about her condition after she died 5 years ago. There were boxes and boxes of jewelry, watches, rings, all sorts of things she'd taken over the years. I tried to research where they came from, tried to return what I could, but most of the pieces had no identifying marks. This locket was different because of the engraving, but I could never find any record of a Sarah M. in the cemetery databases I searched. Jake felt a rage building inside him unlike anything he'd experienced since Sarah's diagnosis. This woman's grandmother had violated the most sacred moment of his life, had stolen the last gift he'd been able to give his beloved wife. The locket that should have accompanied Sarah into eternity had instead become a family heirloom for strangers. "She's buried in peaceful rest," Jake said through gritted teeth. Section C, Plot 247. Sarah Michelle Morrison, 1965 to 1999. Elena's face crumpled completely, and she buried her head in her hands. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I had no idea. If I had known, I would have returned it immediately. I would have brought it to her grave myself." Jake looked at this woman who had unknowingly been wearing his dead wife's jewelry, who had inherited the sins of her grandmother without knowing their true cost. Despite his anger, despite the violation he felt, Jake found himself moved by Elena's obvious distress. She hadn't chosen this situation any more than he had, and her grief seemed as genuine as his own. Slowly, carefully, he reached across the space between them and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It's not your fault," he said quietly. "You didn't know." Elena looked up at him through her tears, and Jake saw something in her expression that made his heart clench. It was the same look Sarah used to get when she was trying to be strong for him during her illness, the same mixture of pain and determination. "What can I do?" Elena asked. "How can I make this right?" Jake looked down at the locket in his palm, feeling its familiar weight. For 23 years he'd believed it was with Sarah, that some part of his love had accompanied her beyond death. Learning that it had been stolen felt like losing her all over again. "I need to think," Jake said finally. This is a lot to process." Elena nodded understandingly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Of course. Take all the time you need." "And Jake?" She waited until he met her eyes. "I meant what I said. Whatever I can do to make this right, I will." Jake pocketed the locket and stood to leave, his mind spinning with emotions he couldn't begin to untangle. Over the next several days, Jake found himself unable to focus on his usual ranch work. The cattle still needed tending, the fences still needed mending, but his heart wasn't in any of it. He kept pulling the locket from his pocket, running his thumb over the engraved words, trying to reconcile its presence with everything he'd believed about Sarah's final rest. He also couldn't stop thinking about Elena, about the genuine anguish in her eyes when she'd learned the truth about her grandmother's theft. She'd called twice to check on him, leaving messages on his answering machine that he hadn't yet returned. He knew she was suffering too, dealing with the revelation that her beloved grandmother had been a grave robber, that family heirlooms she'd treasured were actually stolen goods. On the 4th day, Jake made a decision. He drove to Peaceful Rest Cemetery in Austin, something he hadn't done in over 5 years. The last time he'd visited Sarah's grave, the pain had been so overwhelming that he'd sworn never to return. But now, with the locket burning a hole in his pocket, he needed to see her resting place again. Sarah's headstone was exactly as he remembered it, simple gray granite with her name, dates, and the words, "Beloved Wife," carved into its surface. Someone had left fresh flowers recently, white roses that Sarah had always loved, and Jake wondered who had been caring for her grave in his absence. "I found it, Sarah," he whispered, kneeling beside the headstone and pulling the locket from his pocket. "I found your necklace. It's been gone all these years, but it's back now." The wind rustled through the oak trees overhead, and for a moment, Jake could almost imagine it was Sarah's voice answering him. As he knelt there, holding the locket and talking to his wife's memory, Jake heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see Elena walking toward him, carrying a bouquet of white roses identical to the ones already adorning the grave. She stopped a respectful distance away, clearly uncertain whether her presence was welcome. "I hope you don't mind," she said softly. "I've been bringing flowers every week since I learned who she was. It seemed like the least I could do." Jake stared at her in amazement. Elena had been caring for Sarah's grave, honoring the woman whose jewelry she'd unknowingly inherited. "You've been taking care of her," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. Elena nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. I researched everything I could find about her after you left. I read her obituary, learned about your ranch, about how much you loved each other. I felt like I owed her that much at least. Jake stood slowly, the locket still clutched in his hand. Why? He asked. Why would you do that for a stranger? Elena stepped closer, her expression earnest and open. Because she wasn't a stranger, not really. She was your wife, and you loved her enough to give her something precious. My grandmother stole that from both of you, and I can't undo that. But I can honor her memory, and I can try to heal the hurt that was caused. Jake felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and anger he'd been carrying. I want to bury it with her, he said suddenly. The locket. I want to put it back where it belongs. Elena nodded immediately. Yes, she said. That's exactly what should happen. But Jake? She hesitated, then continued. Would you let me help? Would you let me be part of making this right? Jake looked at this woman who had stumbled into his life carrying pieces of his past, who had shown more compassion for his dead wife than many of the living had shown him. I'd like that, he said quietly. I'd like that very much. Together, they knelt beside Sarah's grave, and Jake carefully placed the locket on the headstone. Elena added her fresh roses to the existing bouquet, and they sat in comfortable silence as the sun began to set over the cemetery. She would have liked you, Jake said eventually. Sarah always believed that good people found each other when they needed to most. Elena smiled through her tears. I think I would have liked her too. Anyone who could inspire the kind of love you still carry for her must have been pretty special. As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Jake realized that for the first time in 23 years, he didn't feel like he was abandoning Sarah by walking away from her grave. Instead, he felt like he was finally ready to carry her memory forward into whatever came next. Hey my friends, help me by subscribing to the channel so we can reach 1,000 subscribers, even if you're watching from your TV or computer. Your subscription makes all the difference, and the algorithm will help you see more amazing stories. Leave a like or an emoji in the comments, and be part of this growth.